All right, today we're going to talk about the last two things about what discouragement does, okay? And again, I'm sure this list is just very small and there's many, many things, but we just don't want to spend forever talking about discouragement. So the number 6 thing is you begin to blame others. Of course, none of us have ever done that, right? We've never blamed others. Oh, it's because I had a bad childhood. Oh, well, I struggled in this subject in school and that's why, oh, I'm no good at math. Oh, I can't speak English. Oh, I have a bad boss. Or no, it's because of the food that I eat. So we all have this backup blame game, right? And when we do that, it's many times because we're just so discouraged, but we have to own what happened. So in 1 Samuel 30, we see about David, right? So David and all his men, and now they've come to Ziklag, and what's happened? The wives are all gone, the kids are all gone, everything's been burned down to the ground. But you know what? It was not David's fault. It wasn't David's fault. But guess what? The men had to blame somebody. They were so discouraged. Everything they'd ever had was gone, and their families were gone. And so they all blamed David, and then they want to stone him, right? So David was pretty discouraged. So what did David do? He had to encourage himself. And this very famous verse, it says that David encouraged himself in the Lord. It also says, he strengthened himself. And we have to make that choice. Instead of just, David could have said, hey, it's not my fault. These people did it, or those people did it. Or, every time we want to pass the blame. But you know what? We have to take that responsibility and say, you know what? Discouragement is not going to take me to a place of blaming other people. I'm going to recognize what's happening right here. It's the enemy. He's wanting me to point the finger somewhere else and never fix the problem. All right? So don't let discouragement make you begin to blame other people. What happened when David took that step? They recovered all, right? They recovered all. Okay, we're going to get into that. But the next thing, the last thing is you move into self-pity. Move into self-pity. And again, let's look at David's men. They're all so sad. They're discouraged. They're having self-pity. Why? They've lost everything. Who can blame them, right? They've lost so much. And you know what? Today, many people have lost so much. People have lost family members. And I even saw on the news, about a newborn baby and how it had lost both of its parents. Before it was even born, it lost the father and then the mother 5 days after it was born. So devastating. It could be so easy to be discouraged. But you know what? God is beyond that discouragement. No matter how deep the loss, no matter how great the setback or the failure may feel, we can't just get stuck in self-pity, okay? Or blaming others. So T.D. Jakes has a quote that I think is so good and it's so true for this. And it says, faith must pass the test of discouragement. So we can say, oh, I have great faith. Oh, I'm just believing God. But you know what? That faith has to pass the test first. And what is that test? When you get discouraged, do you still have faith? Do you still believe God's word? So David had to make that decision. So in the midst of this, everybody's upset, everybody's feeling sorry, then what happens? He had to take a step forward, okay? And he had to overlook everything else that was going on. So they start going and they start walking, and David doesn't know what he's doing. He surely doesn't know where his wives and kids are, but he's taking a step of action, right? And along the way, they meet this Egyptian guy. And they could have just overlooked him. They could have not stopped and helped him, because they are thinking about only themselves. Poor me, poor me. But they stopped. They gave him food. They gave him water. And then what? He ended up being a servant of the very people who had kidnapped their kids. And they could have just killed him out of anger. But thankfully, some of that discouragement that goes into wrong thinking, that's what they would have done. But the Spirit of God was leading David. And so he said, lead us, please, And so he said, okay, he made a deal with them. As long as you promise not to kill me and you don't turn me over to them, I'll tell you. And so what happened, because they could get out of their self-pity and they could see others and their needs, that's the problem. We get stuck in our self-pity and we don't see anybody else's problems. But because they moved past that and David helped that Egyptian servant, he led them and they got their wives back, they got their kids back, and sheep and cattle and all of this whole abundance that God had planned for them. And everyone was so happy, right? So sometimes I feel like you're in the midst of a situation and you're drowning in it. And I heard somebody say one time, when you're drowning in the midst of your fear or your doubt or your discouragement, remember that your lifeguard can walk on water. So that's a great news for us today as we're going the second mile. Our lifeguard, our God, He can walk on water. He is not drowning in our discouragement. He's not drowning in the same situation that's encompassing us. He is above and He is beyond, and His ways are higher than our ways, and His rescue plan is beyond our understanding. So trust Him. Don't drown in the situation. Go the second mile. Reach out, take His hand, and let Him help you cross the victory line.